And through a tweet a few days back, Mansi had recently flagged some alarming trends regarding the functioning of the Indian Parliament. Among other things, she has written about how shockingly there's a less number of Parliament sittings between 2014 and 2021. Mansi, you talked about fewer and shorter Parliament sittings. Uh, why do you think this is happening, and has it happened before? Have we seen this before? How does this affect the parliament's job of holding the government responsible and accountable?
Yeah. Thanks, Neha. Thanks for having me over. It's very important that we are having this conversation, particularly in this year where we are heading into the elections. And I hope that people do pay attention to what has happened in Parliament in the last 10 years when they go out to vote. And it is a consideration that they pay attention to. Now, specifically coming to your question about shorter and fewer Parliament sessions, now there are two ways to look at it. One is that for any government to face a parliament is a difficult job because you have to go there, you have to debate, you have to answer questions being raised by MPs, you have to answer to different allegations being made by the opposition. You have to give justifications for your policy decisions, for bringing different kinds of bills before parliament. So any government other than a government which is committed to constitutional ideals would you know would try to evade coming before parliament as much as possible. So while this is not a new thing that has happened, successively it has happened over the decades since independence that the number of parliament sittings have come down. So in the initial years of our independence, when the first Lok Sabha was formed in 1952, in the initial couple of decades we did have an average of 120 days of session of parliament in a year. Now that has come down to about, in if we speak about the current Lok Sabha, which is the 17th Lok Sabha, which started in 2019, and if we compare it to other Lok Sabhas which completed their full five-year term. So we have had some governments in between which were not able to complete their full five-year terms. But if we just look at in the last 20-25 years, each government has managed to complete their full term. If we look at that, we see that earlier the 2014 to 2019 session had the shortest, the fewest numbers of sitting, and now the 2019 to 2024, the 17th Lok Sabha has had only about, and if I add to it the current session which is going on, it has had about 278 days that the parliament has been in session, which averages to about 56 days in a year. So one is that, of course, the government has tried to evade politically the accountability before Parliament, but there are certain structural reasons for this as well. So I think it is a really big irony that an institution which constitutionally is given the responsibility to seek accountability from the government doesn't have the power to convene itself. So it is only the government currently which has the power to decide when to call a parliament session. And if it is not convenient for the government to face parliament at a particular point of time, it will choose not to have the session or to delay the session. And I can give you several examples of that just from the last 10 years. So for instance, in 2017, the winter session of parliament was delayed by a couple of weeks, and it finally started towards the end of December. Usually the winter session starts in the third week of November and runs on for almost a full month till the mid of December. But that year we had very crucial assembly elections in the state of Gujarat, and that became a reason for delaying and shortening the winter session. This happened again the year after that in 2018 when we had assembly elections in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, and a couple of other states. Again, the winter session, instead of starting in November, only started in the month of December, and that too a very short session happened. Then 2020, COVID became an excuse, for keeping the parliament shut for most of the year. In that year, in fact, parliament was in session only for 33 days in a year. So that's only about a month. So only for 1 month out of 12 months in the year, parliament functioned. And it was attributed to COVID. And this is despite the fact that the world over, many democracies made an attempt to keep their parliament going by convening virtual sessions, remote sessions, etc. Nothing of that sort happened in India. Then in 2022, again, the winter session became a casualty of assembly elections. In 2023, again, that happened. So the list goes on. So basically, if the government has other priorities, the parliament session becomes a casualty for that. And another structural issue, if I would point out here, it is also that once the government is done with its agenda, so the government approaches every parliament session with a set agenda that these are the bills that we would place before parliament for debate, discussion, and for consideration and passing. Now, once the government is done with its agenda, it would end the session ahead of the schedule. This has also happened multiple times. In 2020, for instance, again going back to the COVID year, in 2020, after almost 6 months between the budget session and the monsoon session, there was a long gap of 6 months. The winter session didn't happen at all that year. The monsoon session, which was called, was initially supposed to be for 18 days. Now, even an 18-day session after a 6 month gap was a short session. But in that session, a lot of things happened. We can go into that detail later. But because the government managed to clear all the bills that it had listed for that particular session, it ended the session 8 days ahead of schedule. So basically, in that year also, we lost. The parliament lost several days of its working because the government decided that as soon as we are done with the agenda, the session can be called off. And this also happens because the government has alone has the power to decide when to convene a session, how long the session should be, whether to convene a session at all or not. Even right now, the last session of the current government, which is going on right now, it is a session which started on 31st of January. It will end on 9th of February. It's a very short 8-day session. This is the last session of the current government, the last opportunity for MPs to question the government, seek accountability, to raise any other issues of public importance that they had to raise. So all of this, at least in the last session, an attempt could have been made to have a longer session to fulfill all those things which um, were not able to happen in the earlier sessions. But even this session has been called for a very short duration. So if the sessions become short, it gives lesser opportunities to MPs to ask questions, to raise issues of public importance. So it directly undermines the accountability seeking function of Parliament, and even lawmaking suffers because if there is lesser time and the government has a long agenda that it wants to clear before the session ends, obviously we'll end up spending lesser and lesser time debating each of those bills. And also one final point that I want to make before we move on to the next question, which is that if there are fewer sessions that happen in a year, that also means that there is greater space between one session and the next. So that also creates an incentive, an adverse incentive for the government to rule by ordinance. And I believe this is also something we'll come back later and discuss in greater detail. But this also is a fallout of having shorter sessions, that the government ends up relying more on lawmaking through ordinances than the ordinary lawmaking process, which is through parliament. So therefore, I think shorter and fewer sessions in a year and shorter sessions, shorter parliament sittings in a year directly undermines its constitutional responsibilities of seeking accountability from the government, representing the interests of different constituents, as well as deliberative lawmaking.